All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Go ahead and start out with, well, I guess there's no questions so far. So if you guys want to put any questions in the Q&A section, that would be helpful so we get started off on the right foot here. I am just going to promote a couple of open and close employees to the to a panelist so that they can answer questions while we go through this. So. Okay, anyone from the team have any questions from this week that we want to get started with since there's no questions in the Q&A? All right, everybody's quiet today. All right, well, let's get started with a couple buttons that a lot of people don't see throughout the program. So I'm just going to go through. Oh, here we go. We got a question actually. I'm trying to convert some of my tasks to property triggers. How do I start breaking down my task list to convert into triggers? Yeah, that's a good question. So let me first go through the differences real quick, just in case we have anyone that's not familiar with triggers versus task triggers. So in your tasks, when I check this task off or when I don't check it off by a certain date, you can have things happen. Those are task triggers, not to be confused with intake form triggers, not to be confused with property triggers. So property triggers are more automated. We'll get into that in a second. Intake form triggers only happen at the submission of the intake form and then the approval of the intake form by the TC. So in here, in this particular case, we have 3 emails being sent. All of them when the task is complete. You do have the choice to make this when the task isn't completed. So you do have some flexibility there for contingency periods and things like that, where you want to send out some reminders if you still don't have certain documents or certain information. So, okay. So as you're grouping these and you're change, so what the question is they want to change some of these tasks over to triggers. So triggers are more automated. So these, and let me apply a template here so we have something to work with. I'm going to add a bunch of them here. That may take a minute. Oh, that was quick. Let me see how many are in here. Oh, just a couple. Here, let me apply a couple more templates, see if we can find any more in here. Okay, we got a couple here. So in the trigger menu, what sets this apart, and you do have to be on the scale plan to have these automated, these property triggers. In the inactive or ones that are turned off, so you can see these are turned off. You do have a couple of listeners, which could be fields. This little sonar button is basically listening to these conditions and saying, if either one of these become true, then go ahead and add this field. Or actually that field section, sorry. And then in process are ones, and you'll have more than 3. Maybe at the beginning you have a couple, but you should have a healthy amount of these in process. And these are just constantly looking to see if these conditions become true. Once they become true, then it's going to alert you and tell you what to do. Send an email, add a template. And you can see under here, it's add this template if those become true. So the advantage to property triggers over tasks is you don't have to go to a task list every single day, look through your tasks. You can come straight here and then just have things happen. So instead of going to a task list and checking things off and then have things happen, all you have to do is change a field, change a contact, or change a document. And those may be involved in these conditions to alert you to do something. So let me give you an example. Let me find a good field for an example here. Okay, if I change it to under contract, then what do I want to happen? Do I want an email to go out? Do I want a text message to go out to the agent? Do I want my under contract template to be added for tasks? You know, there's a number of things you can do here. Now you can do all that through the task menu as well and just check off a task, but some people just don't want to be hassled with looking through 60 to 80 pending files to have to do this. So what they do is they do property triggers, which is going to save quite a bit of time. When I change this to under contract, you may have a condition here called if contract status equals under contract, then send this email. And when do I send it? Immediate or at a certain date and time? You can do it either way. So what you're going to do is you're going to come over to tasks and you're going to look at this task, like send opening emails. Okay. So instead of having to check off this task and these 3 emails going out, what I would do is take each one of these and I would make this its own trigger. Okay. So let's just pretend this is the buyer. I'm representing the buyer in this transaction. This is the initial email to the buyer. This is the initial email to the lender, and this is the initial email to the escrow officer. Well, instead of having these all combined in one little task here, what I would do is I would come over to my trigger templates. Now I'm in a transaction, but you would be doing these templates in the template menu. And then I would create a email for the buyer initial email. And then the condition would be if I represent the buyer, if a buyer is existing in this file, if there's a initiation date, whatever your conditions are going to be, you would set those up so that as soon as those fields are changed to the correct thing, it's going to send this email to the health bar and alert you and say, hey, this is ready to go. It'll also be here in this ready to go menu in the triggers. So in ready to go, these are things that have passed their conditions. So this one didn't have a condition. And this one had, if it's equal to buyer, we come over here, it is equal to buyer. That was the only condition. So now it's telling us, hey, this needs to be sent. Okay. So now your TCs, if you're hiring TCs that are maybe a little bit more inexperienced than you, that's okay because you're setting up these triggers and these conditions on when these things need to happen. So they can't screw it up necessarily, right? You're guiding them through this transaction. You're saying, hey, if they come over here and change this field to buyer, then I need this email to go out. If I come over here and I changed the closing date to whatever, something else may happen. If I change the year built to previous to 1972, then I want to add in all my lead-based paint information. So you can see where this could come in handy. And it's not only fields, it's also contacts. So let's just say that if I have a lender in this file, I want to send this email. That could be a trigger. If this document exists, send this email. If this document doesn't exist, send this email. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about this, but basically they're going to sit in this in process menu and just wait for something to happen. So if you're updating fields, if you're updating contacts, if you're updating documents, it's going to run through these triggers every time you make a change and see if it's ready to send. And if it is ready to send, it's going to send it up here to the health bar, and it's also going to send it over here to ready to go. Now, the differences between here is this is a scheduled email. We're giving it actually a date and a time to send it. The ones that are immediate, all they have to do is satisfy the conditions and it's going to bounce up to ready to go because we want to send this immediately as soon as these things are true. Okay. All right. These are ones that have already executed. So I think that's probably deep enough. You can do some follow-up questions if you need to, but that's kind of the difference between, the other thing I would mention is when you're creating these templates, like with tasks, we're very specific. We're like, if it has to do with septic, make it its own task template. If it has to do with well, make it its own well template. If it has to do with financing, make it its own or even break it down further. If it's VA financing, add some tasks. If it's conventional financing, add some different tasks. With triggers, you can be a little bit more lenient, I would say. Because they're just going to sit here in the in process. So if you want to combine some of those at the beginning of the transaction, or you kind of have to think through it and say, hey, if I change a field to, let's just pretend that an inspector went out to the property and finds a well that we didn't know about. Listing agent didn't list it. They find a well. We come over here, we add the fields called well, and then we say, yes, there's a well now. Well, that yes actually, it wouldn't even be a field there. It would probably be in the intake questions, and you would have everything off these in. Is there a well? No. They come here and they say, well, I want to change that. Whoops, sorry, I clicked on the wrong one. I changed this to yes. And what this question is going to do is you're going to have almost like another intake form in this trigger menu. And it's going to say, hey, they changed that to yes. Now we have to trigger the well fields, the well tasks, the well triggers, the well document template, the well whatever, right? So it's going to add all those things automatically. And then all of those things would be sitting in here ready to go based on other fields and things like that that you might need to fill out. So what I'm trying to get at is you can be a little bit more, you can have combinations of what you would have in your task templates and your trigger templates because you never know what's going to happen in a transaction. So you may have more of these scenarios just sitting in process, just in case you change something or something changes throughout the transaction. All of a sudden there's an addendum and they want to add an appraisal contingency, or they want to add an inspection contingency, or they want to add something. Well, then you already have these in process that they can fire. Now you don't have to. What you could do is have, like I said, that intake form, basically duplicate an intake form in here and have those triggers sitting in here in every transaction. That way, if something changes and you say yes to something that you said no to originally, here, if there's septic, if there's well, if there's solar, if there's a referral fee, all these things, then you can have that trigger everything else that needs to come in. Okay. Follow-up question, since my triggers are just waiting for conditions to be met, would I just build all my property triggers into one template? Yeah, so that's kind of what we went over, and apply that template on every transaction, or would I still want to separate out my property triggers to the parts of the transaction that they relate to? Inspection triggers in one template loan. Yeah, so two different ways to think about it, right? And it's going to depend on your process. If you don't want to think, then you can just have, like I had when I first started, I had like 258 triggers or something in one trigger template. I will say that is going to slow down your system a little bit, because every change you make to a field, now it will happen very fast, but I'm talking split seconds, right? And if you're looking to gain efficiency, every time you change a field contact or document, it is going to have to scan through all of the in-process triggers. So if you have 250, it may only take a second or 2 seconds or 3 seconds, depending on what type of computer you're on, but it does have to do that every time something's updated. So if you want to have it a little bit more consolidated, like tasks, what I would suggest that you do is make one trigger template, like an intake form that comes in after the transaction's created, with yes and no. Okay. So if you change well to no, those things happen. It takes that stuff out. If you change it to yes, it brings that stuff in. So you will have to have one template that acts as your intake form for future changes. So just think about it that way. Since my trigger is queued up based on conditional logic, how do I make sure my team updates my fields correctly so we don't miss triggers? Really, that's internal process. You're gonna have to have some training and some videos on what your fields are and when you change them. The one thing I would say is, if someone makes a mistake and comes in here and was trying to change the inspection and actually changes the loan to no, then when you change it back to yes, you're just going to have to check and make sure all that stuff came back in, because you're going to have a yes and no version of your triggers. Okay. And we may have in the future, there may be, like we have for fields, right? For fields, you don't have to update these because these are listeners. Now you do need two listeners. You need a yes and you need a no, but these never leave here. But we can only do this for fields, because what we don't want to happen is you have a yes and a no for templates, and it deletes the template and then brings the template back in for tasks. Let's say, let's use tasks as an example. You have if this is yes, bring in this task template. If it's no, take out. Well, if you accidentally hit no and it takes out those tasks and you put them back in, it's going to put the entire template, and it's not going to know which ones you've already checked off. So we couldn't make these automatic listeners on the template side because it would just be too dangerous. So what we do is we push those up to the health bar, where you have to have a double click. So you have to hit it. And if you made a mistake, you can just come up here to the health bar and delete that out. But if you didn't make a mistake, then you hit apply. But it's just too destructive to have those as automated until we figure out a system where we could go back and read which ones you've done and did, we'd have to go through a long process and a lot more code building to make that work. And right now we're just not there. Okay. But yeah, to answer your question, let me just go back through that to make sure I understood. So since my triggers queue up based on conditional logic, how do I make sure my team updates my fields correctly so we don't miss triggers? Yeah, it was just something you want to talk to the support staff or implementation team about, but this is a great way to do it, is have these questions. So you could have intake questions. You could even have questions after the fact or whatever, but intake questions are a great place to start. You have all your yes or no questions here, financing types, things like that. You can put whatever you want in here. And just know that these are going to correspond to a trigger template that acts like your intake form. So it's basically like a secondary intake form. Okay. Is there a proper order for trigger templates? Add, remove templates, add, remove field sections, add, remove field. Not as much as if you're doing a intake form. On the intake form, you want to add your fields first, because those fields are going to drive future templates down at the bottom being added or subtracted, right? If you don't have the right fields up top, then those templates don't get added. And basically what the intake here, let me actually give you a visual representation because this gets kind of confusing. So if I go into the intake form templates, okay, intake forms act a little differently because every trigger is initiated at the same time, whereas the property triggers are initiated typically one at a time. Sometimes there's multiples that trigger off the same thing. But so if you come over here to triggers, it's actually going from, I'm just going to open these up. So basically it's going from top to bottom, right? Actually, I will turn that back off because that's an email. So it starts here in your fields and it starts adding all the fields that need filled in. Okay. And then it will come down to templates. But the only reason we have to do that on the intake form is because they're all being fired off at the same, well, not at the same time, but in sequential order. So it's going trigger, 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 and it's going boom, 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 boom. And if we don't have these fields set up the correct way, then it may not initiate a template that you meant to if you had that template before the field. Okay. So I know this is confusing. Feel free to put some extra questions in here if I'm not explaining it well, but we need those fields first on the intake form template as it goes down that sequential firing of these templates. Now, the properties are a little bit different because typically you're only firing one or two at a time. So, and the fields on these trigger templates are listeners. So these fields are going to automatically update. If I update something, fields pop in. If I change it to yes, the fields pop in. If I change it to no, the fields pop out. If I change it back to yes, the fields pop back in. Those are very automated. We couldn't do that, unfortunately, with the templates and some of the other stuff, the emails and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, as standard practice, I'd probably keep them the same as the intake forms just to keep them organized and just in case something like that would ever happen. But I think it's way less important than on an intake form. What is the difference? Let me make sure I'm going in order and we answered everything up top here. Okay. What's the difference of me just adding in task conditions of my tasks instead of converting my tasks to property triggers? That's a great question. That is a really good question. So if you're on the scale plan, what this person's talking about, anonymous attendee, you're so secretive, CIA member here. Let's see here. Okay, so I'm in task. Come into triggers. We have the ability to create conditions if you're on the scale plan on these tasks. So when I check off, it's kind of a cool thing, right? Because if you had all your opening emails in this task, let's say there's 8 of them, right? Lender, buyer, seller, listing agent, buyer agent, blah, blah, blah. You got them all. When I check this task off, then what it's going to do is come over to this, but then it's going to say, wait a second, should I send this? I don't think we have any conditions on here. Let me just set one. So if contact role, buyer agent exists on property, right? That might be a good example. Okay. So then let's just pretend this is the email to the buyer agent. So it's not just going to send it like a regular, hit this task, check it off, and all these emails go out at one time. That doesn't happen anymore. What it does is it does a secondary step, which is look through here and say, well, only send this email if the buyer agent exists in the property. And that's fine. If you want to do this way, 100% fine to do it that way. And there's a little kind of workaround here. I don't even know if I should mention this, but there's a workaround here where you can turn this on and say send automatically. So it's going to look at this condition. And if that condition is true, it's going to send this email out without you checking it. I do not recommend that if you have a bunch of smart blocks and merge fields in here. But these conditions are really cool. But the thing that makes the triggers a little better, at least in my case, that I don't have to come to 80 files and look through these task lists every single day. What happens is instead of that, I would have conditions on this buyer intro email. And those conditions would be if the contact role buyer agent exists on the property, right? And then maybe I want another one called if the property field contract client type I'm representing is equal to buyer. Okay, so now my system knows that I'm representing the buyer and there's a buyer in the contacts tab of my file. So I'm good to send this. So instead of me having to go to a task list and look for this task, Now it's just going to happen automatically. When I change those fields from the intake form, it's going to come in and automatically fire this email up to my health bar and say, hey, this is ready to go. And also to the ready to go here. So when you log into this file, all you got to do is come right to ready to go. Boom, it's ready to go because we've met our conditions, and you can just send. So I think it eliminates a step. I think it eliminates thinking. The more we can put bumpers, on this bowling lane for the inexperienced TCs, so that they don't have to think as much. They don't have to make so many decisions during the day. We want to conserve that brain power for, higher level decisions, like what's happening in the transaction. Is this thing falling apart on me? Do I need to notify my agent of anything weird going on? If you're doing these menial tasks all day, like going to task lists, well, that's sucking your brain power. That's sucking your attention. Sometimes you don't get as good a feel for the transaction. Sometimes you don't have that innate sense that things are going wrong when they are. So I like to preserve my brain power. I like to put everything in triggers. But if you feel more comfortable at first, just doing tasks and getting used to that, that's a great intermediary step before you get comfortable with the whole trigger system. Can you put more than one trigger asset into the same trigger template? Let me think about that for a second. So, no, it's not like, let me think about that for a second. I can't remember if I can do that. Let me just try one real quick. Choose template. Yeah, I can. Okay. So, you got two here. Oh, I don't know what that one is. Hold on. Sorry. Let me get turned on the wrong one. Here, template. Add this. Add this. Add this. There you go. So now under my options, I have 3 assets here. And then I can say, if you just got to make sure that these 3 assets are going to be the same. Like if these are all solar assets, solar task template, solar document template, solar something template, right? Then you can do it. You can't mix templates and fields. Those are 2 separate. The way we handle those on the back end are different. But if you want to send 3 templates at one time, just make sure that that condition is the condition that triggers all 3 of these. Okay. I'm starting to use outside intake forms to create my property, and we'll be using these property triggers to add information to my property. What would the intake process look like for someone using outside intake forms instead of OTC's intake forms? Really not much different. I mean, if you're using outside intake forms, hopefully you're using someone like Daniel Poston at Interface or someone like that, that's going to take the information from those intake forms and API that information into open to close and create the transaction. If you're just using an outside intake form and coming and duplicating that somehow, like manual typing or having a VA do it, I would say scrap that idea right away. We don't want you double typing anything. But if you're using someone like Daniel at Interface, where basically he has an intake form, you fill it out, the API zaps over the information into the fields, the contacts, and the documents. And then what you would do is what I described earlier. You would have a template in here, and it would act as the intake form. So you're not actually using our intake forms in the triggering system, but you're using your own intake form. But you still want the triggering system to be efficient. So what you're going to do is create that intake form of what you would normally have in an intake form, those triggers, and create a just property trigger template. Okay, property trigger template. And you would basically duplicate, I apologize, my phone was not on silent. You would basically duplicate what is in that intake form triggers into a property trigger, okay? And then you would just have that sitting here. So when those fields come in, then it's going to initiate all your stuff. The big difference is going to be our intake forms are going to automatically assign all of the templates, and it's going to add, right? So you don't have to do anything. What's going to be different about using outside intake forms is it's going to say, yes, this template needs added, but it's going to throw it up to the health bar. So you're going to have a little extra step, and that's to come to the health bar when you initiate a transaction and say, send, yes, whatever, to all the things that triggered all the templates. Okay, when you add triggers, do you need to, well, let me go back and just make sure I answered that question fully. Yeah, so I did. When you add triggers, what do you need to reapply manage property fields. Oh, do you need to reapply manage property fields and apply property template on I think it says existing properties. So property templates on pre-existing properties. I don't know exactly what you're saying. I think you're saying if you already have a transaction going and you're adding in more triggers like midstream. Yes, okay. So what you would have to do is, if you're adding in more triggers midstream, you come here and you apply this template. As long as the conditions meet up with the fields that you already have in this transaction, you shouldn't be adding field, or you shouldn't be not adding fields that you need for the transaction, right? I mean, if for some reason you didn't, like something changed in the middle, like septic, well, then that's fine. You can come up and manage these fields and add them. But really, all the fields should already be set from your initial intake form or your initial implementation of this transaction. So your new trigger should just trigger off of those fields that are already existing. If for some reason those fields aren't in there that you need for that new template, something's probably wrong. We need to look at your process. We need to look at the individual scenario and figure out why that happened, and then compensate for that. Okay. Now, as far as applying the property template, let's see, do you need to reapply? Yeah, you would need to apply the property template if you're adding a midstream. Or, I mean, this is a big or. There might be just a field that you can change, right, Michelle? So like there may be a field called solar, and you're saying, yes, there is solar. I didn't know there was solar. So you go in and say yes, and you already have your trigger set up to say, if solar is yes, then add my solar document template, add my solar tasks, add my solar triggers, add my solar fields. I mean, on the top property details right-hand drop down here, I don't think there should be anything you need to add unless there's a, circumstance that would need you to do that. I guess I would have to hear more on the specifics. So if you want to email help@open to close, give me the specifics on that. I'll have the onboarding team take a look at your individual scenario there, and we'll parse through it together because you added a new field. Yeah, let's tackle this one individually because I'm not sure. I want to hear the whole process of what's happening to make sure I'm giving you the right answer. All right, cool. Halfway through, and all we talked about was triggers, which is cool with me. I love triggers. So yeah, we can talk about triggers all day. A lot of people, if you were in this conversation and you got in here late, triggers, this trigger menu. Now you have intake form triggers and you have task triggers on every single account. You will not have this property trigger menu unless you're on the scale plan. Okay. If you're looking at the scale plan, make sure you reach out to us and let us explain what the scale plan is, how it all works. Like, don't get yourself in there and just start trying it if you're not sure about what you're trying to accomplish with it. Tasks is always a great place to start. And then, you can always graduate to triggers once you get a little bit more comfortable with the system. Yeah, what does what does the new messaging feature look like? I'm not going to go into that just because we're still developing it, and I don't want to get too far down the weeds and then people, when's this coming, when's this coming, when's this coming type of thing. But I will tell you that messaging, I don't have any in here, but messaging is going to be a way for us to eliminate a lot of emails and texting. Okay. It's basically like, it's kind of a weird analogy, but emails and text had a baby and got all the good DNA and took out all the crap. So basically what it is you can send a message from our system out to a client, out to a vendor, out to whoever, and you can direct it to go to where they want it to. So like you send the message, but maybe your client only responds to emails. Well, then you can say, hey, if this goes to Sally, I want this to be an email. If this goes to Bob, he only responds to text. And if I send it to, Sarah, then she's going to be push notifications. And so we're going to get it in place where you have some options. We're not done with the design. So there's a couple things that may change, but basically what you're doing is you're saying, hey, when I send this message, I want to send it to an email to this person, a text to this person, a push to this person. When they respond, what it's going to do is come right back into your messaging and put a number here. So now all the messaging that you're sending out, it looks like you're sending them emails, so they don't have to go log into some new system and figure out some new, technology, which they're not going to do. They're not going to adopt. So what we want to do is send it to them in the way that they understand how to respond to it. And that's an email or a text normally. And so, but when they respond to it, it comes back in as a message to you. You can see who looked at them. You can see, well, I'm not going to go too far in the weeds, but basically you can reference certain things in that message that are already existing in the transaction. So it's going to be pretty cool. It's going to save a lot of time. There's a secondary component to this that we're thinking about implementing. So more details will come in the next 6 months, but basically we want to get people out of email and texting because that's triage. You're going to texting is not great because there's no thread to it, right? You don't know, like I could send you a message about 123 Main Street, and then I could send you a message about 456 Oak Street, like literally back to back. Like our system has no way to parse those into the transaction without you assigning them. So that's an extra step that you have to click, assign, find the property, blah, blah, blah. With a message, it can be more threaded like an email. The reason we don't like email is because you get in people's email boxes and there's 500 junk emails and they're sifting through those emails. And then not only do they have to find it, but then they also have to assign it to the right property, which with a message, it already knows the property. When they respond to that message, it's coming right back into the property that you've already assigned and open to close. And so you're getting the best of both worlds by using messaging. It's just going to be more of an adoption for your TCs and getting used to it and finding out, there's many more advantages than disadvantages, but there's probably a few disadvantages that people aren't going to be comfortable with. And so we're going to have to get over some of those hurdles during the design process. Do I have to set up portal roles to use the messaging feature? I don't think so. Oh, no, you can send actual users. So just say, I want to send this to Andy Bernard and Dwight and Pam. And here are my users, like my TCs, the license user, and here are my property contacts. This could be escrow, this could be lender, this could be anyone. So you can send it to whoever you want. You can apply a template, which I don't think is on here right now. Oh yeah, it is. You can apply a template. In the future, will we have triggers? I know that's always the next question. Yes, we will. We will have triggers, and we will have an easy way to convert your existing emails into messaging. So if you have an email you like, but you'd rather send it during a message, we have a way to turn that into a message. Basically duplicate that email, change some of the formatting, and send it off as a message so that when the client gets it, it looks like an email, right? It looks exactly like an email. If we send this and they want it during text, it's just going to put that subject right at the top and then just not as much formatting. So you're going to have to look at these and say, hey, this is an email message, this is a text message, or this could be either if I format it right. You're just going to have to make sure that it looks good on both, depending on what you're sending, bullet points, all that good stuff. So really cool feature. And there's a lot of other things that we're thinking about with messaging that could enhance the use of this. But I don't want to go too far, like I said, because I just don't want 1,000 messages about it, honestly. So cool. All right, cool. We're 35 minutes in. Any more questions? Anyone have any more questions? This is a really good session today so far. I love the questions. Really good questions. Well, I'll leave it open for another 5 minutes. As always, let me just, while we're having a little lull in questions, let me point out that in the open to close on the homepage, if you go to learn webinars, we don't just have these workshop Wednesdays. We also have group classes. So you can see this is the morning class for fields. You scroll down here somewhere, I'm going to find the afternoon class for fields. Here we go. Afternoon session for fields. So you can see, you can come here and check out what all the different classes are. This is a really good, like if you're just looking for conversation on, settings and integrations, it's a great place to go. If you just want to talk about documents, it's a great place to go. So don't forget that this is here. Definitely don't forget about our knowledge base. We just had a meeting this morning. They're upgrading some things in the knowledge base, which is going to be so cool for users to be able to find stuff better. So we're constantly working on this stuff to make it a better user experience. In the program, some things that I would definitely look at if you're a power user, I would definitely look at keyboard shortcuts to make your process easier. I would definitely keep up to date on your changelog. because this is all the changes that have been made. June 12th, when was that? 2 days ago. So here's some things that just happened 2 days ago. Is there a difference between putting triggers in task templates or putting them in the trigger templates for tasks? Okay, so let me read this again. Is there a difference between putting triggers in task templates or putting in trigger templates for tasks? Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, there's a difference because you're initiating them in a different place. So everything needs to be templatized. We all know that. So is there a difference between putting triggers in task templates? Well, if you're in the task template, and I'm in a property, but let's just pretend we're in a task template. And then you put the triggers in here, basically you're having to check off the task to get these triggers to go. Putting the trigger templates for tasks, basically what you're saying is, if this field changes to buyer or seller or whatever, all you're doing is initiating a template to come in here, and then you have the same functionality as you normally would in tasks. So one is adding the task template, the other one is actually a piece of the task. So, is there a way to have a default task tag applied to all tasks created in the transaction? So what they're talking about here is these tags, I'm assuming, and you would have to put this in your template. So in your templates, you can put the tags in here, and that way, every time it's applied to a transaction, those tags would be applied. And these tags are great for sorting tasks over in our task pipeline. Let's see here. I asked a question yesterday and ended up harassing Clyde. He was great, and I'm grateful for his time and efforts. Yeah, no worries, Todd. No worries. Clyde's a good guy. He rolls with the punches. I have a new admin that will be assisting my 4 TCs with their files. What's the best way to update my team settings so I can assign tasks to this new admin? Yeah, first step would be going to the teams, going in the teams, adding your new user, and then taking off whatever task roles that the current users are using and apply them to the other user. Okay, so let me just do one. I think I can. Oh, there's only 2 people in here. I don't think I can add a person twice. Nope. But anyway, let's just pretend it's Andrew here. You add that person. They come in here. Let's just pretend this is Andrew. Then I could check off. I could check the things I want Andrew to do for that transaction. Maybe it's just post-closing. Maybe it's just overseeing. Maybe it's whatever. You may have to create some extra roles. If you do create extra roles, and this is why it's really important to, when you first get in the program, to create as many roles as you see fit for the next 15 years. You don't want to have to come in and add roles midstream, because if you add roles midstream, now you got to go back through all your tasks and assign those roles to the right tasks. So if you have 40 task templates with 40 tasks in each one, this becomes a real hassle. So when you're setting up open and close, best case scenario is come in here to your roles, edit your roles, and make as many as you could possibly think of. And it doesn't matter, because if one person's handling that transaction, they can be all of these people. But what it gives you flexibility for in the future is if you hire people that you didn't expect, like a compliance specialist, now all you have to do is uncheck that from the one person and check it on the other person. All the tasks are already assigned to that role. So now it's really easy to update thousands and thousands of tasks throughout the program. If you're doing, 80 to 100 pendings a month, they instantly just change for you. So it's huge, especially if people need to take time off, people get promoted. There's a million different reasons why you would change user roles or user assignments or role assignments to people, because it just makes it really easy to interchange who's assigned to what task. Sorry for the repeat. Can you give the order of operations for the trigger templates? Yeah, field, and then fields first. That's really the only requirement. Date on the intake forms, I like to do dates last, just so everything is in there before I apply the date template. There's really not a huge reason behind that. As long as the fields are in, you could add a date template. Just in my mind, I always keep the date template last, just to make sure that everything is correct before it starts applying those dates. So that's just my neuroses, to put that last, but it's probably a good practice to keep into effect. As far as just the trigger templates in the property though, Michelle, I would say fields first, templates second. The listeners for the fields are totally separate in there. So really you're going to have listeners in there. So it's going to be like, if I say yes to this field section comes in. If I say no, it goes back out. That little sonar button that's constantly listening to those fields, it's going to automatically put the fields in and take them out, not like a template where it's going to go to the health bar. So less important in the actual property triggers for sure. But just to kind of keep the standard practice throughout the whole system, I would do that because everyone's going to see them and just understand them more clearly.
One other thing I wanted to add with the assigning tasks is that, would you mind showing how to mass assign roles to the task templates?
Okay, task templates.
Following Andrew, we're just getting into our task templates. You can probably go, the main buyers under contract task template. I think that one has a number of tasks on it. So for that previous question where you're adding in a new admin, you want to make sure you've got some roles on here. You can go into that task template and you can select the individual tasks by selecting the little button that's right next to the gray one. So this is if you want to select a couple. You can also select all tasks and that'll select all of them. And then from there, you can select change at the bottom. And then we can say task roles, and then you can assign those tasks en masse. And this is another way that you can add on those task roles en masse, as opposed to having to add them on individually on the transaction.
Yeah, typically you're not going to add them to all because it just doesn't make sense on most templates, right. But there could be, it could be like a document task template that like, it's a task for the documents on like what you have to do. And in that case, maybe, yeah, compliance manager gets assigned everything, but this is still cool because you can come down here and just read them and pick the ones that you want for certain roles. And it does cut out quite a bit of time.
Absolutely.
And you can do colors too. That's another one that I don't know if you saw there, but some people like to color code, like to come up with their own color coding halfway through. And they're like, hey, blue is always going to mean this for us. You can go back and a little bit easier now, add those colors.
One other thing that I wanted to review as well is that when we're talking about the intake form and we're adding on those triggers and we say, add on your templates, we're referring to those task templates. We're referring to those document templates. And if you're on the scale plan, we're also referring to trigger templates. I just want to be clear that when we're talking about the templates, we're talking about those specific templates. We're not referring to property templates, which think of property templates as a grouping of those templates, and that would be applied outside of intake forms. Does that make sense? I just wanted to make sure I clarified, especially since Michelle had used that language, property templates, yeah. Fields first, then templates, and she put property templates in there. Property templates are only used outside, if you're using outside intake forms.
Yeah, or property templates could also be used if you're doing a manual intake, manual typing in a new transaction, but most people aren't doing that just because there's so much benefit to the intake form. 100%. Yeah, here are the three types. When you go into a new trigger template, you're going to have to say, is this an intake form template? Is this a task trigger template? Or is this a property trigger? These are the ones that I just showed you throughout the bulk of this. The property, yeah, it gets confusing because property triggers property templates. People get those confused a little bit. The property templates are the way that you're going to use things for either bringing things in through the API or through the manual intake. So if you're using property templates and for manual intake, contact us. Let's get you out of manual, processing, because honestly, the intake forms, even if it's just a TC, filling them out is going to give you so much more bandwidth. You're going to get a lot of time back in your day. You're not going to have so much of a setup on a new property. It's going to be, you're going to appreciate it. All right, 11:44, I'll give you 3 or 4 minutes to get any last questions in, and then we'll go ahead and wrap this up. So I will give you some time here. Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, just know your menus, right? There's a lot of good stuff in here. There's also a lot of good stuff in these global settings, especially in the defaults menu. So make sure you're familiarizing yourself with that. Some of the stuff got added midstream, right? If you've been on the program for a while, you might not have known, if you weren't reading the changelog, that agent portal users can now do a bunch of filtering, but they're not going to have these options in their agent portal unless you check these boxes. So if you want them to have a little bit more control over what they're filtering in the agent portal and they're actually using those, then go ahead and check these boxes. One sheet, some people are like, I hate the way one sheets look, so I'm not using them. And I'm like, did you see you could remove the empty fields? No, I didn't know that. Did you know you could stack the field direction? No, I didn't know that. So get used to, get familiar with some of this stuff so that you know if there's something you don't like and you don't use it because the way it operates, there may be a way to change it in here, like renaming files automatically or whatever, or the way files are sorted or, whatever. All right. I don't see any questions coming through. Give me another minute. In the meantime, great questions today. This was one of my favorites so far, just because we were talking about triggers, and that's my favorite. It's a great way to make your system way more automated, less thinking, more guardrails on there for your TCs that are working on your files for you. And this is a way to, if you are an independent TC, this is a way to get out of production and make it highly efficient so that you can afford to not do files yourself and still make good money. For a team, it's a great way for the team leader and even the attorney getting involved in some of the clauses and the way things are written and things like that, and putting all these guardrails on so that when you have that inexperienced TC, they can't get too far outside their purview on getting creative. We don't want new TCs getting creative until they really understand the transaction and have that expertise. So you can rely on the team leader or the operations manager's knowledge of getting it in here the right way, and then letting them follow that SOP or that system that you've set up for them. All right, cool. Well, thank you for being here. Same time, same place next week. I appreciate everyone. And hopefully I will see you next week. Have a great day.